corridors of power to the streets of small-town America.
Michael Moore's Fahrenheit 9/11 set off a political firestorm and prompted conservative Citizens United to get into filmmaking.
Did you know you were testing the system?
Oh, yes, it was deliberate.
What happened next changed the game on corporate influence in politics.
With Citizens United, it changed 100 years of jurisprudence about what the role of corporate money is in our elections.
As campaign season heats up, we look at Citizens United 10 years later.
California's wildfire season is getting longer and more severe. The U.S. Forest Service says it's burning too much of its money on fighting fires instead of preventing them.
There's a lot of acres on the landscape that need to be treated, need to be managed.
This week, how a new funding fix in the federal budget could lead to fewer fires.
Judge Thomas, do you solemnly swear to tell the truth, the whole truth, and nothing but the truth, so help you God?
I do.
You know the name Clarence Thomas, but do you know his story?
Coming from nothing, from poverty and segregation to the highest court in the land.
A rare and surprising inside look at a Supreme Court justice.
Welcome to Full Measure. I'm Sharyl Attkisson. You've probably heard of the Supreme Court case known as Citizens United. This year is the 10th anniversary of the landmark decision. But odds are you don't know much more than it has something to do with money in politics. As we move into campaign 2020 and lots of money in politics, we sort out what was really behind it and how it's impacting elections today.
There's something you may not know about the whole court battle started by the conservative nonprofit Citizens United. It was inspired by a liberal documentary.
Originally, back in 2004, Michael Moore produced a documentary film called Fahrenheit 9/11.
He's a big liberal activist.
He is a big liberal activist.
Michael Bowes is vice president and general counsel of Citizens United.
Congressman, trying to get members of Congress to get their kids to enlist in the Army and go over to Iraq.
The Michael Moore film criticized President George W. Bush and was released as he ran for re-election.
From the corridors of power,
Congressman,
to the streets of small-town America, comes the true story that will make your temperature rise.
It was the top-selling documentary film of all time. And he ran television ads to promote that film, which were the most effective political commercials against George W. Bush's re-election in the entire 2004 political campaign. They had pictures of President Bush on the golf course, made it look like it was right after 9/11, and he used that very effective politically.
Michael Moore, do you know where his corporate money came from if you're alleging, there was corporate money behind him?
Sure, you're talking Viacom, Sony, the Weinstein brothers. They were behind Michael Moore and Fahrenheit 9/11. I think it was Harvey Weinstein may have personally been involved with that.
At the time, it was illegal to use corporate money to promote or oppose political candidates during the election season. But campaign finance law exempted documentary makers like Moore. Citizens United decided to copy what Moore had done.
And we at Citizens United decided that we wanted to be movie producers and produce our own movies and be covered by the same media exemption.
So did you know you were testing the system, kind of tweaking this after the Michael Moore programming?
Oh yes, it was deliberate. We also wanted to point out sort of the hypocrisy in the law that certain corporations were completely exempt from the campaign finance structure, very powerful media corporations that had major influence over elections, yet an organization such as Citizens United was prohibited from doing the same thing because it wasn't a media entity.
In 2004, Citizens United asked the Federal Election Commission for an exemption to air the political material they produced, like Michael Moore. But the FEC said no because Citizens United had no history of producing documentaries.
This is our production studio.
So the group set out to change that.
Celsius 41.
That was our initial film in response to Fahrenheit 9/11.
They don't seem to be very peaceful.
Over the next 4 years, we produced probably a dozen and a half documentary films.
You became your own conservative version of Michael Moore.
That's correct.
While I was working on those streets, watching those folks see their jobs shipped overseas, you were a corporate lawyer sitting on the board of Walmart.
By the time Citizens United had a dozen films under its belt, Hillary Clinton was facing off against Barack Obama, and the group had a film it wanted to release.
Tell me about the Hillary Clinton film that your group made.
Well, the film was addressed the Clinton years in the White House and the Clinton scandals. And it addressed Hillary Clinton's fitness, from our perspective, to be president of the United States. It did not expressly advocate her election or defeat, but it shed light on her public record and was highly critical of her.
Vindictive.
Mendacious. Venal. Sneaky.
Ideological. Intolerant.
Liar is a good one.
But Citizens United still couldn't get a media exemption because the Federal Election Commission didn't have enough board members to issue a decision. So in December 2007, Citizens United filed its federal lawsuit. They argued the campaign finance law preventing their film's release was unconstitutional. While the case worked its way through court, Barack Obama got elected president. Then in 2009, instead of making a ruling, the Supreme Court threw a curveball. It ordered both sides to argue a much larger question than the Hillary Clinton film.
What was your thought when you heard the court was going to make this a much broader decision than you argued?
We knew at that point that the case was going to be a major precedent.
A special Supreme Court session was held in September 2009. Arguing against Citizens United for the government was Elena Kagan, who later herself became a Supreme Court justice.
General Kagan.
Mr. Chief Justice, and may it please the Court, for over 100 years, Congress has made a judgment that corporations must be subject to special rules when they participate in elections, and this Court has never questioned that judgment.
A blockbuster decision from the Supreme Court today.
The ruling came down in January 2010. The Supreme Court struck down the long-standing ban on corporate money used on candidates in an election period. The Citizens United victory became one of the biggest political money cases of our time.
With Citizens United, it changed 100 years of jurisprudence about what the role of corporate money is in our elections.
Do you think for better or for worse?
I think for much worse.
Meredith McGehee heads up Issue 1. It's a nonprofit group that aims to reduce the role of money in politics. She says the Supreme Court should never have tossed out the original law that restricted corporate spending.
They explicitly overturned that ruling because the majority on the court basically disagreed with the reasoning that corporate money could distort the political process. Okay, so first off, they answered a question that wasn't asked and really went to this decision that corporations can use Treasury funds to influence the outcome of an election.
10 years later, you might be surprised to hear that both sides agree on one thing: the impact of Citizens United isn't quite as expected. McGehee says some corporations that tried funding political races suffered a backlash.
Target was involved in a race, and they gave a contribution to a group that was supporting a governor, a gubernatorial candidate, who was not in favor of gay rights. And then Target had people marching in front of their stores. Why are you supporting someone who is, against gay rights? Who wants to put up with this backlash, particularly if you're a forward-facing, consumer-facing, corporation?
The other side had said it would result in this massive corporate spending by publicly held multinational corporations, which would drown out the voices of everyone else by spending upwards to $1 trillion an election cycle in order to impose their will on the people. The fact of the matter is that has not happened at all. These publicly held corporations are extremely risk adverse.
We, the people, believe this is corruption.
Whatever the case, recent polling shows strong opposition to Citizens United, with a majority supporting a constitutional amendment to reverse it.
To those who hear Citizens United and equate that with something very negative in terms of campaign spending, what do you say?
We've had a profound impact on politics in the country. Before that decision, no one even knew what the Citizens United name was about. Now we're sort of like a brand name in the world of politics. Everyone's heard of Citizens United. Now some people may have a negative reaction to it, but among our friends, the reaction is mostly positive, and so we're quite happy with that.
This past week, a Democrat-led House subcommittee held a hearing on Citizens United with the goal of figuring out how to reverse it. Head on Full Measure, you're spending billions of tax dollars for California's fires. We follow the money and look at the newest ideas to save land, lives, and money. $80 billion is one estimated cost of last year's wildfires in California. Some have long argued these huge expenses could be lessened if we spent more tax money up front preventing fires in the first place. Lisa Fletcher reports a fix is finally kicking in.
This fire season, we followed the U.S. Forest Service to see their daily race to stop disaster.
What's the best prevention tool?
You know, there's not one tool. It's a variety of tools.
Jason Sieg is a district ranger at the El Dorado National Forest, an hour east of Sacramento. He showed us a site where crews do this. Intentionally set a controlled burn to eliminate brush and vegetation that could fuel a wildfire.
A fire could still move through here eventually, potentially, but if it did, the goal is that it would be at an intensity and a rate of spread to where suppression resources could be in here and work effectively.
A different effort a mile up the road, where what looks like logging is actually fire prevention. Trees are thinned to strip away branches that would fuel fires. Then they're shipped to mills.
You know, there's a lot of acres on the landscape that need to be treated, need to be managed.
El Dorado alone spans nearly 800,000 acres. Protecting all that land is a massive, expensive endeavor. And too often, those efforts are shortchanged when money shifts from prevention projects to emergency firefighting. 4 years ago, we decided to follow the money. Here's then head of the Forest Service, Robert Bonney, in 2016.
Last year, in a bad year, we spent north of 60% on fire-related expenses. So you can see that the agency is being more and more less a Forest Service and more a fire service.
At the time, the U.S. Forest Service was spending so much of your tax dollars on emergency firefighting, it said it was forced to borrow from other important budget areas, robbing from efforts to prevent fires in the first place. There's evidence of that beyond this line of green trees in El Dorado. This is where the King Fire burned in 2014, scorching an area bigger than Atlanta and forcing the evacuation of almost 3,000 people. Fighting that fire cost $117 million, putting budget pressure on the already strained Forest Service. In 1995, 16% of the Forest Service's annual budget went to fires. In 2015, that was up to 52%. And without change, by 2025, it was projected to be near 70% of the budget spent on wildfires. But that change may have arrived in 2020. This year, the fire funding approach is different.
This is going to be the first year that we're going to be able to explore a new tool that Congress has provided with the fire funding fix.
President Trump signed a spending bill in 2018 that includes a fire funding fix starting this year. The fix allows the Forest Service to use federal disaster relief funds, treating fires more like other disasters like floods and earthquakes. It also raises the funding for firefighting by more than $2 billion.
This new model that we're going to
Deputy Regional Forester Tony Scardina calls it a good first step.
And so at least in this situation, we'll have that increased level of funding on the suppression side and not having to borrow from the prevention and mitigation side.
Though there's a lot to figure out.
One of the common threads when talking about the current situation was that it's sort of akin to we've stopped the bleeding, but the patient is still in the ER.
Yeah.
Does that sound about right?
Yeah, it sounds about right. You know, we are a long ways away from trying to turn the corner. We have to keep making steps forward. The fire funding approach and some of the help from Congress is going to help us take that step, but there's a lot more to it than that.
California's fire season is starting earlier and ending later, posing a threat to communities all over the state. The hope is new federal funding will allow the Forest Service to put the focus back on prevention.
And besides money, there's a political factor.
There is. Last fall, President Trump actually tweeted that California's governor had done a terrible job of forest management and threatened to cut off federal funding. What a lot of people didn't know is that more than 50% of California's forests are owned and managed by the feds.
Really interesting story. Thanks, Lisa. Coming up on Full Measure, he is known as the quiet member of the Supreme Court, but Clarence Thomas speaks in a surprising new documentary. This year, a new documentary about Clarence Thomas was released. Even those who know something of the second African-American Supreme Court justice and his background are bound to learn some surprises. I recently spoke with Michael Pack, producer-director of Created Equal, Clarence Thomas, in his own words.
When I was 6, I wandered the streets by myself. You were hungry and didn't know when you'd eat. Someplace in my life, the road split off. I'd gone to the seminary. I'd gone to all white schools. I was never going to be a part of that world. I was never going to be white. The problem is I could never go back completely to the world I came from.
I mean, it is a great story, a story of a Horatio Alger story of coming from nothing, from poverty and segregation to the highest court in the land.
The documentary traces Thomas's birth in 1948 to a poor Georgia family that spoke a form of Creole. His father left the family. Thomas often went hungry and had no bed to sleep in. His mother, working as a maid, gave her 2 sons to their grandfather to raise.
And that is what changed Justice Thomas's life. His grandfather gave him hard work and values. His grandfather was a Catholic, a rare thing for an African American in the 50s in Savannah, and sent him to parochial schools. And he thrived in that environment, and he even decided he wanted to become a priest. And he entered the seminary. Not that many people know that.
I didn't know that.
However, it was the late 60s, and the seminaries had been all white until very recently. He was one of the first African Americans to attend. And there he started to experience racism.
Disillusioned, Thomas says he ultimately left the seminary, which caused his grandfather to kick him out, and Thomas became a radical.
And so he became an angry black man, as he says. He suddenly felt race and racism explained everything. And he supported every person, the more radical, the better. Angela Davis, Huey Newton, Malcolm X. And then he gradually saw the errors of that. And that was the beginning of his coming back to both his faith and what he thinks of as the values of his grandfather and the nuns, and becoming conservative.
I saw what I had become, lashing out at every single thing. And I asked God that if you take anger out of my heart, I'll never hate again. And that was the beginning of the slow return to where I started.
Thomas went on to work for President Reagan, a conservative Republican.
I want my candidacy to unify our country.
I was under constant attack. You're not really black because you're not doing what we expect black people to do.
That I will nominate Judge Clarence Thomas to serve as Associate Justice of the United States Supreme Court.
That's when all heck broke loose.
Judge Thomas began to use work situations to discuss sex.
We know exactly what's going on here. This is the wrong black guy. He has to be destroyed.
Did he reflect at all upon current events, such as the Kavanaugh confirmation hearings, where Maybe not unlike Justice Thomas, sort of at the 11th hour, accusations were raised against Kavanaugh, a conservative nominee of the Trump court.
Well, in the interview, he did not want to reflect on other political issues, as is common for Supreme Court justices. But I agree with you, Sharyl. I think it's inconceivable that he can't have been flashing back to his own confirmation battle. The Kavanaugh hearing seemed to follow the Thomas playbook.
One of the things that is often said about Justice Thomas today is that he just sits back and doesn't really say much or necessarily do much with the court, just sort of lets it happen around him. What did you find?
There are a lot of myths about Justice Thomas, and that's one. For example, he's written over 600 opinions, 30% more than any other sitting Supreme Court justice. 30% more, not just a little bit more, including Ruth Bader Ginsburg and the others. He writes a lot. He doesn't speak in oral argument, and that makes people think he isn't active. But
Why
he is
doesn't
active.
he do that, do you think?
Part of the answer is definitely that he doesn't believe that that's the role of judges. Each advocate on each side of a case has 30 minutes to speak, and if judges ask questions that takes from their time, he thinks they should be allowed to make their presentation. But the real work, as Justice Thomas says, is when they write opinions and circulate opinions and talk among themselves. And he's very active in that way.
What does the whole story of Clarence Thomas to date say to you?
I think Thomas's story is one of resilience against a great deal of opposition. He's always coming back. And he refused to define himself as a victim, which he could easily have done.
So you'd still like to serve on the Supreme Court?
I'd rather die than withdraw. I wanted to be able to say I lived up to my oath and did my best.
At age 71, Justice Thomas is the longest serving among the current members of the Supreme Court at more than 28 years. Stay tuned. I'll be back in a minute to tell you what's ahead next week. Next week on Full Measure. More than a decade ago, crashes and deaths linked to a Goodyear tire led to a string of lawsuits.
It is truly the worst truck tire made in history, to the best of my knowledge.
Now, with some of the tires still on the road, there's a federal investigation and allegations of a Goodyear cover-up. A Full Measure investigation next week. Until then, thanks for watching. We'll be searching for more stories that hold powers accountable.